Hey, Jarett, welcome to episode 1 and the official launch of our And It Matters Because podcast.
Hey, Rach, super excited to be here. And thank you so much for getting together and helping launch our podcast.
Yeah, thanks for being the co-host for this. We have been dreaming about this, folks, for a really long time. During this podcast, which will be a monthly podcast, we're going to explore how and why integrity, cheating, technology, and politics matter when it comes to education, workforce, and assessment. So welcome to episode 1. My name is Rachel Schoenig, and I am CEO at Cornerstone Strategies.
And I'm Jarett Dyer. I'm a professional proctor and vice president at Surpass Assessment.
Today, we are going to talk about why we started this podcast, some of the ways cheating actually does hurt more than just the cheater, and play a really fun game called Never Have I Ever Integrity Edition with the award-winning Ray Nicosia. And we'll learn a bit more from him about his experiences in educational assessment and in test integrity.
And now the disclaimer.
Here's our disclaimer. Nothing in this podcast is intended to be, nor should be construed as legal advice, nor are we establishing an attorney-client relationship.
What if I tell you about a time that I cheated?
You've already told me about the times that you cheated. Your statute of limitation is run. You're fine.
Excellent. And so, Rach, let's take a moment to kind of look. We've had a lot of conversations, but let's share with the audience why we thought this topic was so relevant, especially now.
Yeah, I think understanding the value of assessment, the value of education, and the value and importance of integrity has probably never been more important than it is right now. But this has been a conversation that we've been having for a while. And I will just say, like, my own experience with standardized assessments and education, I am an attorney, so I had to take a standardized test to get into undergrad. I had to take another one to get into law school. I had to take 2 bar exams, one for Iowa, one for Illinois. And I will say at that time where I was in that process and, with the information that I had no idea what went into creating valid and reliable standardized assessments. I had no idea how people were relying on those in so many different ways beyond just how I was looking at the value to those assessments. And I also at the time had zero clue that anyone would ever try and cheat on something that was so high stakes. And I think being able to have those conversations is important.
So let me ask, like years later, how has your perception changed?
Well, my perception changed once I got into this industry. So I started off as a litigator. I loved what I did. And at a certain point, I was recruited to come in-house at a large admissions testing company. And I remember driving to that interview thinking, how many people could really want to engage or would be engaging in misconduct that they need somebody to lead up the work on this? And I was shocked when I got in-house that the work on this, meaning exam integrity, I had a team of 20 people who every day, Jarett, we were looking at and investigating and opening score validity cases or other cases around test misconduct every single day. That the numbers actually, they shocked me. It just was nothing that I would have ever imagined someone would do. And the number of people who were actually attempting to do that across not only admissions exams, but workforce and licensure exams, it was definitely eye-opening to me from an integrity standpoint.
Interesting. I wish I could say that I have been shocked. I've shared the story with you before and jokingly said that I needed to have attorney-client privilege for this, but it was a few years ago, so I feel comfortable sharing it. I think my understanding of high stakes assessment and integrity matters within that started quite a while ago when I was an undergrad. At the time, I was taking the state assessment to drive an ambulance. I've been studying for a while. I was a good college student. I stayed out a little too late the night before. Not
Probably
doing
studying.
Studying, partying a little too much. Slept right through my alarm, arrived at the testing location, a little bit later. And so this test, there was a written exam, there was a practical exam. I arrived for the practical exam, passed that, and it was getting into early afternoon. And honestly, right at the end, our instructor, who also happened to be our examiner, came up to me and he said, "You're the only one. Do we really have to stay here and finish up the written test?" And to this day, I'll never forget. Blew my mind. He just holds me on the shoulder and he says, "I'll tell you what. How about I give you a B and I buy you a beer?" And I looked at him for a second, and at the time in my brain, I said, "Man, that sounds like a great idea." Okay, my future self, I told you I needed maybe a little attorney-client privilege here. You said I'm beyond my statute of limitations, so I can share. So the audience, don't try to do the math, but I think we've had these experiences, right? And so these to us are really the foundation for why we want to have this podcast and kind of go forward.
Yeah, your story, I'm sorry to say, is not a story that stands alone. In fact, recently there was a case in Muncie, Indiana, where a fire captain was actually allegedly involved in, I'll call it a cheating ring, where he was an instructor, kind of like your ambulance instructor, and he was asking his recruits when they would go take the exam to give him the live questions. And so these recruits allegedly, and we do have some text messages that ended up being reported on this, were told, invest back in him, basically, with the trust that he gave them. He allowed them to see the questions in advance, and they could invest back in him then by sharing the questions that they could remember, so that he could keep those questions fresh on those exams. And I think that's very concerning. Obviously, it was an issue in Muncie, where both firefighters and EMS personnel were provided test questions in advance, and that matters.
Yeah, absolutely. It's twofold, right? It's one thing to say, well, it's a violation of the rules, and so they shouldn't have done that. But when you kind of peel back the onion on it a little bit more, what in essence he was doing was receiving those answers from, live content from those exams, so he could then really teach to the test, give those exact questions. And so instead of actually learning the material, the other candidates in his classes could basically just go in and memorize the content, not really absorb it and understand it, and just pass the test without as much involvement, or perhaps without actually knowing what they were doing.
Yeah, I think, for those individuals, by engaging in that unethical conduct, by violating the test rules, and there's a reason that those rules are in place, that Muncie fire captain was in a position where he was undermining the state's ability to really protect the public and make sure that only people who were qualified were serving in EMS or emergency response positions. And obviously that's something that we see as important. There's a reason we want them to take these exams, or there's a reason we want them to understand a certain body of knowledge to be competent to help us when those emergency situations arise.
Uh-huh. Absolutely. I mean, we rely, it's public health, it's public trust. When you're in a situation, heaven forbid you ever have to call 911 and someone arrives, you really, really hope that not only do they have the certification, but they also have the competency, right? That they know how many milliliters you need to get. They know how long you need to wait. They've done their CPR classes, not just gotten that checklist. And I'll be honest, going back to my own personal situation, we'll elaborate on that in a second. There was a time that I would be driving and say, I hope I don't break down around here, right? I was a little concerned. That's just where, to be perfectly honest. So.
Well, I know you said, Jarett, you had a time where, in your first outing with the ambulance, where you were coming into the hospital and you couldn't remember the codes because,
absolutely.
I remember you were nervous about that.
Absolutely. I mean, first time out, and a little bit, I was saying, maybe this is a little bit stage fright that I'm going through in my mind, and remembering on that written portion, it was a test to make sure that we knew how to communicate with the hospital when we were arriving. And frankly, Rach, I didn't know the codes. That's a
And I think
terrifying
that's just
situation.
right. It is. It's terrifying for a lot of reasons. And I think that's just one example of why we wanted to have this podcast, because we wanted to share what we have learned over the past, several decades about the value of assessment, about the value of integrity, and about the impact of technology and politics on education and workforce assessment, and the impact of cheating, and why all of those things should matter to all of us.
Well, Rachel, we're back, and we're looking at specifically about today's title. We put a lot of thought into opening, especially it's September, right? We're looking at going back to school. Often, we've heard before, if you cheat, you only hurt yourself. That's the name of our episode today. Tell us more how we landed on that particular title.
Yeah, I think we wanted people to think about the fact that actually that is not true. When people engage in assessment misconduct, in academic integrity violations, there can be much broader harm caused by that. So in the Muncie case, for example, where you had a fire captain allegedly recruiting people to tell him what the questions are on the exam so that in turn he could tell other people, and his recruits may not actually understand the information. They just know the test questions in advance, but they may not have a complete knowledge and body of information to actually be able to safely be EMS or firefighters. There's clearly a public harm that could arise from that, because people who are relying on these individuals to respond to emergency situations may not have the requisite skills. At the same time, there's also a potential harm to their coworkers. You're talking about people who are responding in emergency situations, and if it turns out people pass these exams simply because they had the questions and answers in advance, not because they actually were competent to become emergency personnel, that can absolutely have harm to the other people who they're practicing with and who are relying on them to know what to do in these situations. And I think there's also a harm to people who maybe are not getting a job because someone who fraudulently obtained these credentials are being offered positions that they're not competent to perform. And at the same time, someone who honestly passed their EMS exam or their firefighter exam is not being able to actually provide those services safely and effectively to the public. So there's a lot of downstream harm from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in particular is one of the things that we want to explore in this podcast and kind of unpack each episode, how that impacts and the public and how it impacts the different industries that we're going to be looking at. So
that's right. Yeah. The cheating doesn't just hurt the cheater. There's a lot of other people. And when we think about, cheating in standardized tests or really most cheating incidents that I know I have investigated, cheating almost always hurts others, whether it's the other honest test takers, whether it is, other people who were relying on those scores to be valid to make important life decisions, or whether it's the public that those assessments were there to protect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll unpack this more. Got some great stories for other episodes. But when we look at the airline industry, when we look now, right, space industry, previously looking just plumbing, crane operators, there's been a lot of cases over the years, and we'll kind of unpack those that look, and when we talk about, harming the public, looking back at Muncie, it's not just 4 or 5, 6 or 7, right? In some of these cases, it's been catastrophic. Like hundreds of people have been impacted because of 1 or 2 potentially small miscalculations in someone's educational journey. And so it really, really does matter. And it really isn't just harmful to the cheater.
That's right. And I think, those are going to be some of the things that we're going to dive into during this. We're going to have some political and philosophical conversations. We're also going to have some messier conversations where we're really getting into some of the practicalities of why these assessments matter and how people who have engaged in these activities without integrity have really harmed others. The reality is that cheating and providing commercial cheating services, those are big business. And those attempts to undermine integrity in education and in standardized exams, those can have a really negative impact on all of us.
Absolutely. Well, Rach, I'm excited and thank you, but it's not all going to be serious. When we get back, we're going to move into our first game with our first special guest. So stick around. Here we go. All right. And on that note, we're actually going to shift gears to a new segment that includes our colleague and the godfather of test security, Ray Nicosia.
Whoop, whoop. Ray is the 2025 Lifetime Achievement Award recipient from ATP. He has investigated tens of thousands of exam security and exam integrity matters around the world for education and certification and licensure exams. And we are super grateful to Ray for being our first guest here on the And It Matters Because podcast. So Ray, before we get further into our segment, tell us a little bit about how you got into exam security.
Sure. I was a reporter by trade. I made the transition to media relations, which actually took me into professional boxing, where I got a chance to work with, people like Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield and Sugar Ray Leonard, quite a few people like that in the early to mid 80s. I then took the media relations skills to a TV station, which then took me to educational testing service. And I came in in media relations, but then I developed a fondness for the test security side. I got to work with my predecessor quite a bit. And when the position opened up to take over a test security office, I was hired. So in July 1995, I took over test security for educational testing service. So I've been in the game for over 30 years now. I think that makes me the longest tenured person in the field. And with that, I've been blessed to have a great staff. I've worked in about 45 countries. I have been inside 700 plus test centers.
Yeah, you are definitely the longest running exam security expert in our space. So we're super happy to have you here today. We're going to play a game, given all of your vast experience, called Never Have I Ever, the Integrity Edition. So here's how we're going to play that. I'm going to ask you and Jarett a question, and if you have done it, you have to tell the story behind it. If you haven't, then you get to pass, and I'll keep score to see who wins the Never Have I Ever Integrity Edition game. Do you guys have any questions?
So hopefully I will beat Jarett, since Jarett's crushing it in the fantasy football league as opposed to my team. So we'll see how we can do in this game, Jarett.
I think I'm right in the middle.
Anyone, it's my first fantasy. So we hit a buzzer. We just say, I have. What do we do?
No, I'll call your name and you can say pass or you can tell me the story. Okay, here's how it goes. We're going to try the first one. Never have I ever seen a test taker try to sneak in crib notes or a cell phone into the testing center. Jarett?
I have. And actually, so one of my favorite, we had an individual that the lead proctor really was suspecting something was going on because they kept actually taking an unauthorized break. They were noting it. And they got very suspicious. So short story long, we found out they were hiding their cheat sheet in a second pair of socks. So it was between the first pair and the second pair of socks, taking the shoes off in the restroom, taking off the sock, reading, and then putting them back in.
All right. The classic hide the note in your sock trick. Right. Nicosia, what do you have?
Oh, I had an interesting case in Hong Kong a few years ago where we wand our test takers when they come into our test center looking for electronic devices. But the people were not doing a great job with the wanding, and the individual wound up putting a cell phone on his head and wore a toupee to cover up the cell phone. So he was able to reach underneath the toupee and pull out his cell phone to try and record the test questions. And luckily, we were onto him. We were tracking him through our analytics, and I was able to observe him in a closet on a closed-circuit TV and confront the individual. And we got a nice confession and some fake passports at his house out of the deal.
Wow. All right. So you both had a story for that one. So you both got a score 1-1. All right, so we're going to try it again. Never have I ever seen a test taker try to test and drive at the same time. Jarett.
I have. I hope I get the point in this one. We recently had someone, and it was classic. So this was through third-party remote proctoring. There were some flags going on because the sunroof was opening and the bridges, he was going under like bridge abutments, and it was flagging the fact that the background was changing. The report kind of came back that the person was in their car, and I'm like, well, this does happen, right? We saw this through the pandemic where individuals were like in a Starbucks parking lot, etc. I didn't think too much of it until we opened the video, and sure enough, this individual was driving down the street with a laptop in his lap. We soon found out that he was vaping and using a unauthorized aid in the car. So the first question most people ask me are was it a Tesla? Was it in self-driving mode? It was not. It was it was an older car. They clearly had to drive. So we actually reached out just for a public safety announcement. Like, please don't ever do this again. And by the way, you're gonna have to test in the testing center.
Outside of your car, leave your vape and your car and your cheat notes out in the car. How about you, Ray?
No, I mean, our standards with our proctors are they're not allowed to launch a test unless they have a private room with no one else in the room. We've had plenty of people try and log in bars and different places on bleachers of a football field, things of that nature, and we won't let them test in that situation. So we would block them and say you need to go into a private room where no one else could be accessible.
Much safer. All right, 2-1. Next question. Never have I ever seen a proctor tackle a test taker suspected of test misconduct. Jarett?
Pass.
Ray?
I can't say I've personally witnessed this. We have had quite a few proctors take one for the team. And my favorite story is a 54-year-old woman in Texas who saw someone with a dollar bill in his hand. And she told him to put that away. And during the test, he goes, oh, yeah, I'm going to buy a soda during the break. And she came back later, and he was looking at the dollar. And the guy was 20 years old, and she wrestled the dollar bill, literally on the floor, wrestling with the guy, got the dollar bill away from the man who had the answer key written on the dollar bill. So it was a report that I verified through interviews, but, it was, I wish I was there to see it, but I love that woman for her effort.
That is dedication to a cause right there. Mm-hmm. All right, here's the next one. Never have I ever investigated a corrupt testing center or cheating ring. Jarett?
I have. I think I've shared this story before, and I'll make this one it's kind of lengthy, involved human trafficking, so I'll try to shorten it down a bit. But we, in short, some of our proctors came forward and said, we're really kind of getting uncomfortable. There are individuals that are coming in. They seem to really struggle with the language, but they're consistently passing at a very similar rate. And they are all taking the same test. So we actually reached out to the local law enforcement, and eventually were connected with Homeland Security. They started conducting an investigation, and turned out all of the individuals were coming from one school that were providing the answers to the candidates. So we worked with our state licensure board as well. And to the best of my knowledge, that school, we left the investigation at that point, but we were informed that they were looking at suspending all activities at that school.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's such a horrible example of some of what we see from an integrity standpoint when it comes to commercial cheating services and some of the things that can happen within our industry. All right, Ray, how about you?
Sure. This has been a big part of my career. Unfortunately, there's always going to be one or two people trying to circumvent the system. We have tested at our high inside 25,000 different locations around the world. Overwhelmingly, the people who run the test centers could be educators, teachers, principals. Overwhelmingly, they're very ethical. My wife is a teacher. I've met so many great people in my job, But every now and then you have a school, for instance, that will break open, say, the test books and prepare their students with the live questions, because then they could put on their website how well their students do on these particular tests. And of course, then they could charge more tuition to go to that school. That's a rather common investigative activity I've had to take. All parts of the world, unfortunately, this has happened. It's on the rare side, but it does happen. That's why we track all the test centers by performance and do undercover investigations, secret shoppers, things of that nature on all different test centers.
All right, you guys, you're tied at 3-3. I think maybe we just need to call it a tie. I don't want to have to pick one or the other of you. So great work.
Come on, we need a deal breaker.
You need a deal breaker? All right, let's see. Never have I ever had someone offer me money to allow them to engage in test misconduct. Jarett.
This is so unfair. Ray's going to say yes. So, all right, can I do it by proxy? I'm going to do it by proxy.
Yeah, sure.
We had a student worker that actually it was a student athlete that came in, and they really needed to take a math test or to get a grade to complete their math course. And they were working with another college, like another program that we were proctoring for. So we had the test, right? And so they came in, they offered an iPad if they could take a look at the test for 30 minutes before they actually sat to take for it. And I'll never forget, like, the student worker, he was great. He was like a great Boy Scout. He walked right into my office and he's like, I have never heard of such a thing. I needed to report this right away. And I'm like, you're the best. You ever want to come back and work for me in the future? Just let me know.
Yeah.
Right. Good. Well, way to do the right thing, student worker. All right, Ray.
Well, Jarett mentioned student athlete, and unfortunately, in some of our testing programs, athletes need to get certain scores on tests to get college scholarships, which had me interacting with quite a few coaches, basketball, football coaches from major universities throughout the United States when we would be investigating some of their student athletes, put it that way. And yes, have I been offered cash? No. Have I been offered 2 tickets to a bowl game? Yes. Which, as a sports fan, it took me a lot to say no to that, but I have my ethics. So.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. All right, I'm going to give Ray, you get a full point.
Yeah.
Jarett, I'm going to give you that point. Yeah, so Ray wins. Nice job. That's awesome.
I got the point by proxy, which clearly is illegal.
That's all right. It was like an impersonation you did there.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to give that point to Ray. And before we get done with this segment, I do want to ask Ray, you've been in this industry for a really long time, and you've investigated a number of different cases. We just heard about a few of them. One of the things that I think is important for us, and we call this Why It Matters, or It Matters because we want to talk to you why this matters from your perspective, that people approach education and assessment with integrity.
Well, I've always said if you have a test score, you have to be able to stand behind it, and someone's going to use that test score for an admissions purpose. But moving over to the certification side, I've worked on medical exams where people have cheated to get into medical school or get a certification in a medical exam. But probably the one that stands out the most was the Pakistani Airlines situation about 5 years ago, where out of about 800 pilots, 150 used an impersonator to take the test to become a certified pilot. And there was a plane that crashed in Karachi, killed almost 100 people because the pilot had used an impersonator to take his test. Yeah. So, I mean, there's probably no greater example than that you could think of when it comes to cheating on a test and why it matters.
Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly right. So we're going to talk about on a monthly basis why assessment matters, why education and credentialing matter, and why integrity through that process matters. So thank you so much, Ray, for being here. We do want to hear from you, from our listeners. So let us know any questions that you have. Send in those questions to us at info@cornerstonestrategies.org. If you have questions about cheating, about testing, about academic integrity, although not whether Jarett is licensed to drive an ambulance, we want to hear from you. So again, that's info@cornerstonestrategies, all one word, .org. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on the launch of this podcast. Thank you so much, Ray, for being our very first guest on the And It Matters Because podcast. And Jarett, as always, thanks for co-hosting this with me, for launching this dream of ours to share the value of assessment and education and why integrity matters in that process. So we'll look forward to speaking with you all next month and to hearing from you in between then. Thank you.